Welcome to Beyond Earth Stories. Tonight, we travel not across space, but across time back to a moment when the world was dying. Before the dinosaurs, before the forests, before even the whisper of human thought, there was a silence that covered the earth like a shroud. This is the story of what came after the end. The story of rebirth. Now, close your eyes. Let's begin. The world was quiet. Too quiet. From orbit, the planet looked wounded, a sphere of dull red and brown, its atmosphere tinted with the color of rust. There were no green forests to break the horizon, no blue seas reflecting the sun. Only a landscape of ash, scorched and dry, stretched from pole to pole. I drifted above it weightless and still watching as the light of a distant sun bled weakly through a veil of smoke. The earth was breathing, but each exhale came slow and heavy, like an old god struggling to remember what life had felt like. The great extinction had come and gone. 9 out of every 10 living things were gone, erased, scattered into dust. The oceans had boiled, the skies had turned black, and the forests, those vast, endless jungles of the Permian world, had burned until only shadows remained. Now all that was left was silence. And I, the witness of worlds, could only watch as a planet tried to remember itself. Below me, I could see the scars of cataclysm, the endless fields of basalt that had once been rivers of fire, the Siberian traps, vast ancient volcanoes that had vomited death for centuries, still glowed faintly like dying embers under the crust. The air shimmered with heat. The surface cracked and shifted, breathing toxic gases that rolled across the plains. Everywhere there was decay, and yet there was something else too, something alive. Beneath the fractures of stone water still moved, trapped deep underground, seeping through the remains of the mantle. Tiny primitive life stirred within it, single-celled survivors, invisible to the naked eye, but carrying within them the memory of creation itself. They clung to vents of warmth, to pockets of chemical energy left behind by the fires that had destroyed everything else. They were the smallest things the universe had ever called brave. I watched them. For them, time had no meaning. A second, a century, it was all the same. They divided, multiplied, drifted. They built small worlds within worlds, carving new beginnings from the ashes of the old. And above them, the planet slowly turned. Every rotation brought a little less darkness. Every year the atmosphere thinned and cleared just enough for sunlight to pierce the veil. The light that reached the surface was weak, pale, but it was light nonetheless. The oceans that had evaporated began to return drop by drop from the sky. Rain fell in thin, poisonous sheets, at first hissing as it struck the hot rock. But it fell endlessly for centuries. And slowly, quietly, it began to cool the surface. Steam rose from the ground, forming clouds. The skies shifted from red to gray, from gray to silver. It was as if the earth were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The first rivers returned. They didn't sing, yet, didn't carve their way through fertile valleys, not yet. They crawled uncertain through plains of ash, carving channels that would one day hold the weight of oceans. Everywhere I looked, there was a fragile balance between death and rebirth. The fire beneath and the water above fought endlessly, reshaping the surface, forging new continents, erasing the last remains of the old. In the center of the world, a supercontinent stirred, Pangaea, stretching across the equator like the spine of a sleeping beast. Its deserts were vast and red, filled with dust that had not known rain for centuries. But along its edges near the coasts, life was beginning to whisper again. Tiny ferns and mosses crept across the ground, finding moisture in cracks and shadows. The first forests, pale imitations of the lush jungles that came before, began to grow. And within those shadows, small lizard-like creatures scurried, their bodies low to the ground, their movements uncertain. They were the descendants of survivors, beings that had endured fire and famine, the heirs of a world that refused to die. It was a quiet world, but not an empty one. Everything that existed was there for a reason, because it had survived something no world should. And in that survival, there was something sacred. I felt the planet's pulse returning. It was faint, but steady. A heartbeat beneath stone, a rhythm that whispered again. The wind returned first, shy, careful, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Then came the rain, persistent, cleansing, unstoppable. And finally, the sea, ancient, familiar, reborn. When the first waves touched the newly formed shores, I thought I could hear something. A sound like memory, like the earth remembering its own name. And as the tides began to move again, carrying salt and heat and life across the continents, I knew this was not the end of the story. This was the pause between heartbeats, the breath before the song, the silence before life remembered how to sing. The silence that had blanketed the world was beginning to tremble. At first, it was subtle, a pulse beneath the crust, the faint echo of magma moving somewhere far below. Then came the fractures, hairline cracks cutting through miles of ancient stone. The ground groaned like something immense turning in its sleep. Beneath the scorched plains of Pangaea, the earth was shifting again. Pressure had been building for centuries beneath its skin gases trapped in molten caverns, minerals melting and folding, currents of fire twisting through darkness. When it finally broke free, the planet did not whisper. It screamed. From the northern reaches in a land that would one day be called Siberia, the surface erupted. The crust split open like a wound, and rivers of magma spilled across the land. The air filled with light red gold, and violent painting the clouds in colors that no living eye would ever see. The ground burned for centuries. Mountains rose and fell within lifetimes shorter than a breath in the scale of the universe. Oceans boiled at their edges, sending walls of steam high into the atmosphere. Lightning crackled through ash storms that spanned continents. The planet was tearing itself apart and rebuilding at the same time, chaos and creation bound in the same heartbeat. Even in ruin, the Earth was never still. From orbit, it might have looked like a living heart beating in waves of fire, pumping molten rock across its surface, reshaping itself from the inside out. The scars of the old world, the dead forests, the blackened oceans, the fossilized remains of ancient life were being erased. In their place, new land was forming, volcanic plateaus, basalt plains, the foundations of mountains that would one day cradle rivers, forests, and the steps of humankind. And yet amidst this inferno, something astonishing began to happen. Where fire met water, life stirred. It began in the smallest corners, places untouched by the worst of the heat. Deep within the cracks of cooling lava, where mineral-rich steam condensed into droplets, microscopic organisms clung to survival. They were the descendants of survivors, inheritors of a world that had refused to die. The vents that lined the new ocean floors became sanctuaries. Jets of scalding water burst through the rock, rich with iron and sulfur. It was a toxic paradise, lethal to anything complex, but perfect for the simple. There, in the dim glow of the deep, life began to rebuild. Single-celled organisms adapted to heat and acid thrived. They formed mats on the stone-built colonies in the cracks and fed on the chemical chaos that surrounded them. For them, this was not a world of death. It was home. And above, the earth continued to burn. The sky was still heavy with ash, but each eruption sent not only fire, but also the ingredients of future life into the air. Carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, toxic, now essential later. As the atmosphere thickened, it trapped heat but also light. The greenhouse that had nearly destroyed the world was now the cocoon from which it would be reborn. Centuries passed. The magma rivers cooled. What had once been glowing molten plains hardened into black rock, stretching to the horizon like frozen seas. And with every new eruption, layers formed atop layers, a geological record of death and resurrection written in stone. When the fires finally began to quiet, the rains returned. At first, they fell with fury storms so dense, they stripped mountains bare. Carving, new valleys filling the basins with torrents of mud and water. Then the rhythm slowed, the clouds thinned, and the earth began to breathe differently. The air was still poison, but thinner now. The sun's light, once scattered and lost in the haze, began to reach the surface again. It was weak, golden, hesitant, but it was light nonetheless. Across the black plains, steam rose where rain met cooling stone. In that steam, tiny drops of condensed minerals fell back to the ground, forming ponds and lakes, rich with chemicals, the same primordial brew that had once given birth to life eons before. It was as if the planet remembered the recipe. Within those pools, life multiplied. Microbial colonies spread like brushstrokes of green and gold across the stone. They absorbed sunlight, exhaled oxygen, and slowly began to rewrite the atmosphere. It was an invisible revolution, a rebellion of cells against the emptiness. From the air, the world still looked barren. But look closer, and it was alive quietly, stubbornly alive. In the shallows, colonies of cyanobacteria formed domes of stone and slime. These stromatolites, humble and ancient, began releasing the gas that would one day fill the lungs of giants. Each bubble of oxygen rose, drifted upward, and vanished, too small to matter, yet powerful enough to change the future. Far beneath the surface, the planet continued its secret work. Tectonic plates shifted, pushing mountains higher, splitting continents apart. Deep oceans began to form where the crust dipped, collecting the runoff from endless rain. These basins, dark and cold, would become the cradles of life sanctuaries for evolution to begin again. As the centuries turned to millennia, the fires of Siberia dimmed. The air cooled. The red glow that had once painted the skies gave way to muted gold and silver. And with it, the first fragile equilibrium returned. Now, rivers flowed without boiling. Rain fell without acid. And though the land was still bare, the foundations of soil, the broken remains of volcanic rock, mixed with the decay of early microbes, began to form. It was rough, sharp, unforgiving, but it was a beginning. On the edges of the new oceans, the first multicellular organisms reappeared. Tiny, soft-bodied creatures, ancestors of what would one day crawl, swim, and walk, drifted through the water. They were few, fragile, but determined. They lived short lives, but each death left behind nutrients, shaping the chemistry of the seas, paving the way for the next generation. It was the same story written over and over across time. Destruction, adaptation, renewal. The earth had found its rhythm again, and in that rhythm, something new was being born, a world not of the old, but of transformation. Over the next 10 million years, continents shifted further apart. The interior of Pangaea baked under a relentless sun, its deserts stretching wider with each passing century. At the edges near the coastlines, storms gathered the boundary between heat and ocean, feeding endless cycles of rain. Lightning tore through the clouds, igniting the air in blinding flashes. Each strike carried nitrogen from the sky to the soil, a spark not of destruction, but of chemistry. With every storm, the world became richer, more ready. The same forces that had once killed now nourished. In shallow pools, the air shimmered with heat and energy. Lightning struck the surface, splitting water molecules, recombining elements, forging new compounds in the space of a heartbeat. The chemistry of life was no longer a dream of the past. It was happening again here, under this young and broken sun. And then came color. Where once the land had been gray and black patches of green began to appear. Simple plants, mosses, lichens, primitive ferns took root in cracks and gullies, drinking from the rain and feeding on sunlight. They grew in silence, spreading slowly but steadily, painting the basalt plains with the first hint of life's return. The air, too, began to change. Oxygen accumulated thin and uneven at first, but growing year by year. It carried a new scent, the smell of rain on stone, of minerals and growth. The planet that had once drowned in fire was learning to breathe again. At night, the skies glowed faintly red from distant eruptions, but the stars shone through for the first time in centuries. Their light fell upon a world transformed, scarred, wounded, but alive. In that fragile light, the future waited. Unseen, unborn, inevitable. And far beneath the crust, the planet continued to turn, slow, ancient, eternal, dreaming of what it might become next. The new world did not rise in silence. It breathed through storms. Thunder rolled over the newly formed lands, echoing between jagged mountain ridges and young valleys still scarred by molten rivers. Clouds swollen and electric crossed oceans that had only recently calmed from centuries of boiling. Each flash of lightning seemed to remind the earth that it was alive again, that even in its scars it still possessed energy, purpose, and memory. The rains came endlessly now. They fell over bare rock, seeping through cracks, carving paths that would become rivers. They carried the ash of ancient eruptions into the sea, spreading minerals that seeded new ecosystems. The surface of the planet, once a wasteland of glass and blackened basalt, began to shimmer with a wet sheen, an alchemy between water and stone. Slowly, life began to climb out of the oceans. It started with mats of mosses and lichens that clung stubbornly to stone, breaking it down grain by grain, turning death into dust and dust into soil. That soil in time became fertile enough for new growth. Ferns unfurled their delicate leaves. Spores rode the wind, and soon green began to creep across the dark land. It was not beauty in the way humans would later define it. It was raw, primitive, almost eerie forests of towering horsetails and giant club mosses stretching skyward through the mist. Their roots gripped the earth like the fingers of titans, pulling nutrients from the decaying remains of those that came before. Insects followed soon after. Their fragile wings glittered in the light filtering through the dense, humid air. They were small, yet their arrival marked a turning point. For the first time, the land moved on its own, no longer only through wind or quake, but through the rhythm of living motion. The earth had begun to hum again. And from that hum, something larger began to stir in the swamps and deltas. Fish-like creatures, armored in scales and gills, began to experiment with the impossible to rise above the surface. In the stillness between tides, some would drag themselves onto the shore, gasping, twitching their fins, pushing awkwardly against mud and moss. Most would die within minutes, their gills collapsing in the dry air. But a few would live long enough to adapt, long enough to try again. Those who did, over countless generations, began to transform. Their fins grew thicker, jointed. Their lungs, once vestigial, strengthened. Their skin developed protection against the burning sun. And so, by the silent decree of nature, life began to walk. The first amphibians emerged not as conquerors, but as survivors. They moved clumsily between two worlds, the water that had birthed them and the land that now tempted them with endless space. Their footprints pressed into the soft mud beside ancient rivers became signatures of the planet's persistence. The forests grew denser, the air heavier with oxygen. Lightning danced more frequently across the sky, a natural feedback between life and storm breath and fire. The earth, it seemed, was in conversation with itself. Volcanoes still smoldered in the distance, but their fury had softened. Their smoke carried minerals into the atmosphere, mixing with the oxygen exhaled by plants. Rain washed it down again, feeding roots, deepening soil, creating a cycle both destructive and nurturing, the same duality that had defined Earth from its birth. Over millions of years, continents continued to drift. The vast supercontinent of Pangaea dominated the globe, a single expanse of land ringed by endless ocean. Its heart was dry, hot, and cruel deserts stretching beyond the horizon where only wind and stone survived. But along the coasts and lowlands, the world thrived: green jungles, immense swamps and rivers teeming with new forms of life, and among these new forms came predators, reptiles. Their skin, armored their eyes like molten gold, began to dominate the land. They were the inheritors of both fire and water creatures, forged by extremes. Their scales reflected the sun like shards of obsidian, their lungs filled with the thick air of an oxygen-rich world. They hunted in silence, each movement a calculated act of evolution's precision. For the first time, the Earth had creatures that ruled not by instinct alone, but by awareness. They learned the rhythm of their environment, the rise and fall of tides, the pulse of heat and rain. They learned patience, cunning, survival. And through them, the world began to develop complexity, a web of life connected by hunger, by balance, by adaptation. At the same time, beneath the surface, the planet's core continued its ancient dialogue. The magnetic field shifted, sometimes weakening, sometimes reversing entirely. Each shift brought with it chaos storms, radiation extinction, but also renewal. Every few million years, the Earth seemed to reset itself, not out of cruelty, but necessity. And yet, through every catastrophe, life endured. The planet's resilience was not just physical, it was philosophical. Every time it burned, it rebuilt. Every time it froze, it remembered. The Earth was learning in its own silent way that destruction was merely transformation. As the Triassic dawned, the age of reptiles blossomed. Giant amphibians gave way to creatures faster, leaner, more deliberate. The land echoed with the sound of footsteps, claws against stone wings slicing through heavy air. The forests darkened beneath canopies of ferns so large they blotted out the sun. Insects evolved to match the new giants, dragonflies with wingspans as wide as a human arm, beetles armored like knights. It was a world of breath and thunder, a planet in motion once again. From orbit, Earth glowed with life. The continents shimmered in shades of green and rust, the oceans in deep cobalt. The scars of fire had become veins of vitality. The very same energy that had once annihilated the old world now sustained the new one. And yet, even in this flourishing balance, there were hints of another turning point ahead. The atmosphere was thick, volatile. The magnetic field wavered again. Volcanoes began to awaken beneath the seas, whispering warnings in plumes of smoke and bubbles. It would take millions of years for their voices to be heard, but already the next cycle of change was preparing itself. The Earth never rested long. Still, for now, it was a world of abundance. A planet reborn from fire and ash had become a cradle once again. As dawn broke over the steaming jungles of Pangaea, light spilled across ferns glistening with dew. The air shimmered with warmth, filled with the sound of life, the hum of insects, the call of reptilian throats, the rustle of leaves as creatures moved unseen through the mist. There was peace in this chaos, a harmony only nature could compose. Everything that existed was both fragile and eternal, temporary and infinite. And above it all, the planet turned slow and steady beneath a sky washed clean by millennia of storms. Its story, one of death, fire, water, and rebirth, was far from over. But for now, the world exhaled. For the first time in ages, Earth rested. The world was vast again. It stretched in every direction, forests like emerald seas, mountains that pierced the sky, rivers so broad they mirrored the horizon. The air shimmered with humidity, and life a heavy breath that rolled across continents. Every inch of Earth seemed to pulse. The jungles were loud, a symphony of croaks, clicks, and thunderous calls. Enormous ferns unfurled under the weight of the morning mist, each droplet of water sliding down leaves older than memory. And within that lush cathedral of green evolution was at work, relentless, ceaseless, divine in its rhythm. The age of giants had begun. The creatures that moved through this world were unlike anything that had existed before. Reptiles, no longer confined by the fragility of amphibian lungs, ruled the land. They towered over the undergrowth, their bodies vast and armored, their movements deliberate, each footstep shaking the soil that had once been ash. Some were herbivores, colossi, that moved in herds, consuming forests as they passed. Their necks arched like living bridges between earth and canopy. Others were predators, sleek and patient, with eyes trained on motion, their senses tuned to the faintest vibration of the ground. It was a time when the planet tested the limits of form. Wings began to unfold first from insects, then from reptiles. Creatures leapt from cliffs and glided through heavy air, their shadows passing like whispers over the ancient swamps below. Flight had entered the story of Earth. The oceans, too, were alive in ways the land could scarcely match. Beneath waves thick with plankton and warmth, fish the size of boulders drifted lazily through the currents. Predators with jaws like gates of bone hunted the shallows. Coral forests bloomed in slow motion, sculpted by light and time. In these waters, the earliest ancestors of marine reptiles appeared streamlined forms built for speed, their limbs reshaped into flippers, their eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the glitter of the sun above. They moved like thoughts through water, silent and purposeful. It was not only the size of life that astonished it, was its imagination. Nature was experimenting, combining old blueprints with new ambitions. Every living thing carried a memory of extinction in its blood, and so every new form was an answer, an act of adaptation against the inevitable. The forests became theaters of survival. Carnivores stalked from the shadows, their movements as ancient as hunger itself. Their scales rippled with moisture, blending into the green world around them. When they struck, it was with precision, a flash of muscle, a burst of sound, then silence. And yet this violence was not cruelty, it was necessity, the balance between creation and destruction that kept the earth alive. Above it all, storms continued to shape the land. The sun baked the plains, then fled behind clouds that unleashed torrential rain. Thunder shattered the stillness, lightning split the skies, and rivers overflowed, carving new paths to the sea. The planet was alive not only through its creatures, but through its very weather, the heartbeat of geology, atmosphere, and life in synchrony. Each storm was an echo of the planet's beginning, fire replaced with water, destruction transformed into renewal. In the far south, mountains began to rise once more. The Earth's crust folded and broke under invisible pressure, lifting ancient seabeds into jagged peaks. Fossils of long-dead creatures buried beneath oceans now lay exposed under a new sky. The planet's memory was surfacing. The wind carried dust from these peaks across vast deserts, particles that would one day feed distant forests. In that dust, the past and the future met. It was during this time that the air grew thick with oxygen, perhaps more than ever before or since. Insects grew monstrous dragonflies, with wings wider than a human's reach, centipedes as long as serpents. Their existence was a direct result of abundance, a world so rich it allowed excess. But abundance always comes with consequence. The climate began to shift. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance tilted. The same lush jungles that had fueled life now drew carbon from the atmosphere, cooling the planet. As vegetation spread, the Earth exhaled less heat. Winters lengthened the poles, darkened glaciers began their ancient crawl. Change once again was coming. The creatures did not sense it, not yet. They continued their endless cycles, feeding, breeding, dying, and feeding again. But the planet was preparing another turn in its story, another lesson in impermanence. Volcanic activity began to rise in the east. Rivers of lava cut through forest and plain, releasing carbon dioxide in thick waves. For thousands of years, fire and forest fought in silence, each altering the other. Where one died, the other grew. And through this slow chaos, new species emerged, more resilient, more cunning, more aware. Reptiles adapted to heat. Their eggs grew tougher, their lungs more efficient. Those who could not endure the new dryness perished. Those who could thrived, evolving into creatures that would define an era. Some learned to hunt in packs, to communicate through sound and posture. Others learned stillness, becoming nearly invisible in the brush. Intelligence, not of thought but of instinct, began to emerge. Predators that calculated prey, that strategized. Evolution was no longer blind, it was deliberate. Far above, the stars observed in silence. The constellations were the same as they had been for millions of years, though no eye yet existed to name them. The earth rotated beneath that infinite darkness, its surface alive with movement, its core whispering with the heat of its birth. For all its noise and struggle, the planet was peaceful in purpose. Everything that lived upon it, whether giant or microscopic, was part of a single experiment, the continuous unfolding of possibility. From the ashes of one extinction, a new world had grown. From that world, giants walked again. But in time, as always, giants would fall. The world had grown too vast, too full of its own power. The jungles of Pangaea stretched for thousands of miles, endless in their reach, the breath of life thick and heavy beneath their canopies. The sun itself seemed to slow above them, trapped in the green haze of a planet overflowing with oxygen and ambition. Everywhere life reached upward. Ferns towered like trees. Trees grew like mountains. The air was damp and golden in the dawn, shimmering with motes of pollen and dust. Insects enormous and ancient buzzed through shafts of light that pierced the foliage, their wings trembling with invisible energy. The giants ruled these lands, the great reptiles armored and elegant, who moved with a confidence born of dominance. Some grazed upon the endless greenery herds that thundered across the plains like living storms. Others watched from the shadows, their eyes glinting amber in the filtered light, waiting for weakness, for motion, for a heartbeat out of place. It was a world at equilibrium, violent, yes, but balanced. Every predator had its prey. Every death gave way to growth. The earth breathed in rhythm with its inhabitants. But beneath that surface harmony, tension was building once more. Deep within the crust, the planet stirred. Heat rose unseen under the heart of Pangaea. Tectonic plates, vast invisible titans, pressed against each other, their slow collision gathering energy over millions of years. The surface trembled, forests split, rivers changed course. The air began to thicken. Something subtle but catastrophic was beginning. Far to the north, the first fissures appeared, thin cracks in the earth that exhaled steam and sulfur. At first they were harmless, no more than scars upon the land. But within centuries, the fissures widened, merging into rifts that belched flame and ash. Lava spilled over jungles, swallowing life in glowing waves. The sky darkened. For the first time in an age, the light of the sun dimmed beneath a ceiling of smoke. Days became orange, nights glowed red. Acid rain fell, eating through leaves and soil alike. The lush forests that had covered the planet began to wilt, their roots choking on toxins. And yet, even in destruction, the planet was methodical. It was not chaos. It was balance being rewritten. Volcanoes rose across the land like ancient towers, their summits vomiting fire into the heavens. Ash clouds circled the globe, cooling the atmosphere, even as greenhouse gases trapped heat below. The earth was fighting with itself, ice and fire wrestling for control of its future. In the oceans, temperatures rose. Coral reefs bleached, and the great fish that had ruled the shallows vanished into deeper waters. The balance that had sustained life for millions of years faltered, and species after species began to disappear. It began quietly, one kind of fern, a breed of lizard, a type of fish. Then, like falling dominoes, the losses accelerated. Within a geological blink, half of all living species were gone. The age of giants was ending. Yet even in its dying breath, the planet was not mourning. It was changing. The supercontinent of Pangaea began to tear itself apart. Fault lines split. The land's entire mountain chains sank beneath the sea, and oceans began to invade the fractures. New coastlines appeared jagged and raw, and from the depths rose plumes of magma that reshaped the world map entirely. Continents drifted apart like rafts on molten seas. The earth, once unified, was now becoming many. The climate turned unpredictable, scorching summers followed by glacial winter storms that crossed entire continents, lightning that burned forests faster than they could regrow. In this unstable world, Only the adaptable survived. The great reptiles rulers of the lush Triassic jungles either perished or transformed. Some grew smaller, faster, more intelligent. Others sought safety in the seas or skies. The ancestors of dinosaurs began to appear, their bones slender but strong, their lungs efficient, their blood warm. They were not yet the masters of Earth, but evolution was already sharpening them for that destiny. In the lowlands, mammals took their first steps into the story. They were small, secretive, soft-furred things, prey to almost everything, yet endlessly resourceful. While giants clashed above, they thrived below, hiding in burrows, feeding at night, learning the art of survival through subtlety. Their time would come much later, but already the seeds were planted. Nature was not wasteful. It was patient. Above them, all the storms raged. The skies bled red and gold, lightning forking across the horizon. The planet's pulse was feverish, a body in transformation. For thousands of years, the fires continued. Entire regions turned to glass from heat. Oceans bubbled. But slowly, as always, equilibrium began to return. When the volcanoes finally quieted, the smoke cleared to reveal a world reborn. The air was thinner now, cooler, calmer. The jungles had receded, replaced by open plains and sparse forests. The diversity of life had been reduced, but what remained was stronger, more specialized. Evolution had rewritten the script again. The survivors of this new Earth were not the same as those who came before. They were faster, with keener senses built for both endurance and adaptation. Predators hunted in packs. Prey learned to migrate with the seasons. The rhythm of life had changed, not a steady hum, but a dynamic pulse, unpredictable and alive. And in the midst of this new order, the first true dinosaurs emerged. They were not yet the colossal beasts of legend. They were small, bipedal, agile shadows darting between trees, eyes bright with awareness. Their claws were precise, their movements almost graceful. They were hunters of opportunity, creatures of balance, born from the lessons of fire and famine. Within a few million years, they would grow into something far greater. But for now, the Earth rested in a fragile calm. The great age of reptiles had ended, yet its echo would soon rise again, in forms more magnificent than any that had come before. The continents continued to drift. Oceans widened. The air cleared. For the first time in tens of millions of years, starlight reached the ground, unbroken, glittering upon the edges of newly formed seas. It was as if the planet had exhaled a sigh of exhaustion, of renewal, of quiet before the next storm. The silence that followed was not empty. It was anticipation. For deep within the Earth's crust, beneath shifting continents and cooling seas, the cycle was beginning anew. Volcanoes slept, but their hearts still glowed. The molten blood of the planet waited, patient and knowing for the moment when it would rise again. And above it all, life continued, smaller, humbler, wiser. The world had learned that nothing lasts forever. It had burned, drowned, frozen, and healed, and still it turned indifferent, magnificent, eternal. The dawn that followed the long silence was unlike any before it. The sun rose over a world transformed, continents, fractured oceans wide and restless, and skies cleaner than they had been in an age. The air, once thick with ash, now shimmered with moisture and light. Clouds gathered above vast inland seas, their reflections rippling across waters filled with the hum of new life. From the ashes of the Triassic, the Jurassic world had awakened. It was not a fragile rebirth. This time, it was a declaration. Every mountain, every leaf, every breath of wind spoke of confidence. Life had survived destruction once more, but now it thrived with a vigor unseen since the dawn of creation. The land was alive in every sense. Forests of towering conifers rose into the sky, their needles whispering with the wind. Ferns blanketed the ground, while vines climbed trunks like green serpents reaching for the sun. Insects darted through golden light, some as large as birds, their wings casting fleeting shadows over pools of clear water. And within this cathedral of green, the rulers of the earth emerged. They were unlike the lumbering creatures of the past. They moved with purpose, balance, and power. The dinosaurs had come into their own not as survivors, but as sovereigns. On the open plains, herds of massive herbivores grazed beneath the weight of an endless blue sky. Their footsteps shook the ground like distant thunder. Necks, arched tails swept like pendulums. Eyes glimmered with the calm of creatures unchallenged for generations. They traveled in silence in numbers beyond counting their movements, shaping the very landscape. And above them, the first great predators watched. They stood tall and still, their shadows long and sharp in the morning light. Each muscle, each breath was precision. When they moved, it was as if the world itself leaned to watch a blur of speed, a flash of teeth, a dance of instinct and inevitability. This was the golden age of dominance. Predator and prey locked in eternal motion, yet neither destroying the balance that sustained them. The earth was vast enough for all. In the air, the story of life took a new direction. Creatures that had once glided now truly flew. Their wings beat against the sky with confidence, their feathers early primitive yet perfect, catching sunlight in flashes of color. Pterosaurs soared across coastlines and canyons, their cries echoing like laughter through the valleys. The seas, too, were kingdoms of power. Massive marine reptiles patrolled the deep, their silhouettes gliding beneath the waves like ghosts. Fish shoaled in glittering spirals, coral reefs bloomed in colors unseen on land, and the tides moved with a rhythm that echoed the pulse of the moon. Everywhere the planet was alive with motion. Volcanoes smoked along distant horizons, but now they no longer brought destruction, they fed the soil with minerals enriching the land. Rivers carried those nutrients across continents, creating fertile deltas, where forests grew thick and endless. Rain came in steady cycles, feeding jungles that would one day become stone and memory. It was as though the earth had finally learned balance. And yet beneath its calm, the old patterns still stirred. Change slow, invisible, inevitable was always waiting. Continents drifted apart more rapidly now, tearing open rifts that would one day become the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The Earth's crust groaned, the deep mantle shifting like muscle beneath skin. Mountain ranges rose at the edges of continents sculpted by invisible hands. Each tremor was a reminder, nothing on this planet was ever permanent. Still, for millions of years the age of rain endured. The dinosaurs, vast in form, diverse in kind, filled every niche of existence. Some grew to unimaginable size, creatures longer than rivers and taller than trees. Others became hunters of the air, their eyes sharp enough to see motion from miles away. Even the smallest of them, quick and clever, carried the legacy of survival written in their bones. The earth was their canvas, and evolution their artist. In the highlands, the climate was cooler. Mist clung to the peaks where streams cut deep canyons into ancient stone. Down below in the valleys, the air was thick and fragrant, a mixture of sap rot and life. It was a time of abundance, but also of delicate balance. The great herds consumed entire forests, their appetites reshaping the landscape. In response, plants evolved defenses, thorns, toxins, rapid growth. It was an arms race written in green and blood. And from that conflict, the world became even richer, more intricate, more aware. New species appeared not through accident, but through opportunity. When the rivers shifted, new deltas formed. When mountains rose, rain patterns changed. And every time the environment altered, evolution answered. But not all change was gentle. In certain regions, the earth trembled again, deep rumbles that echoed through the roots of mountains and across entire seas. Volcanoes awakened. Some erupted quietly, releasing steam and smoke into the humid air. Others unleashed firestorms that blotted out the sun. The balance trembled, but it did not yet break. For now, the world endured radiant and defiant. Under a blood-red sunset, herds crossed plains that would one day become deserts. The ground shimmered with heat dust rising behind them like waves. Predators followed at a distance, silent and patient, their eyes glowing like twin embers in the dark. Night descended. The stars shimmered in skies untouched by pollution or memory. The Milky Way stretched like a river of light, and the earth turned beneath it in slow majesty. There was peace of a kind, the kind that exists only in moments between storms, because deep below the planet was already preparing its next chapter. Magma rose through fractures unseen. The magnetic field wavered again. Temperatures climbed, then fell erratically. It began with a whisper, a subtle imbalance in the carbon cycle, a slow rise in atmospheric gases, a shift in ocean currents. It was too small for the creatures of Earth to notice, but it was enough to set the future in motion. The very abundance that had built this paradise would soon become its undoing. But for now, under the steady glow of twin moons reflected in the seas, Earth rested in splendor. The age of rain was the planet at its most alive and at its most fragile. It was beauty on the edge of fire. For millions of years, Earth had known harmony. The continents had settled into familiar positions, though still slowly drifting apart. The seas had found their rhythm pulsing in tides that matched the pull of the moon. Rain came when it should, seasons turned with quiet precision, and life, from the smallest spore to the largest beast, had filled every corner of the world. This was the age of perfection, the still moment before the tremor, the long inhale before the storm. The forests of the Cretaceous stretched farther than imagination. Leaves the size of shields unfurled toward the sun, catching the golden light of a warmer, thicker atmosphere. In the distance, herds of colossal creatures grazed through fern valleys, their bodies moving like ancient machines of muscle and rhythm. The ground trembled under their weight, the air vibrating with their breath. The planet had never been so alive. Flowers. New, fragile inventions of evolution bloomed for the first time. Their colors painted the landscape with brilliance never seen before. Yellows, purples, deep scarlets, colors that called to insects that promised exchange nectar for pollen, survival for beauty. It was the beginning of cooperation in a world once ruled by tooth and claw. Insects swarmed through sunlight carrying pollen across fields and forests. Birds, descendants of scaled hunters, sang above them, voices echoing between canopies that had never known music before. The air itself was different now, sweet with oxygen, rich with scent, full of unseen dialogue between leaf root and sky. Every living thing was connected. And yet, beneath this perfection, something ancient and restless stirred. The Earth's crust shifted once more. The plates beneath the oceans pushed and pulled building pressure deep within unseen chasms. Volcanoes, quiet for eons, began to murmur again. Their voices were distant, almost tender, but they carried the tone of inevitability. Across the western edge of what would one day be North America mountains rose violently sculpted by colliding worlds. Forests toppled, rivers diverted, and the land itself twisted under the invisible hands of geology. Each quake was a reminder that paradise was borrowed time. In the oceans, changes came slower, but no less profound. Currents shifted, temperatures warmed. The chemistry of the water, delicate and exact, began to drift from its balance. Coral reefs struggled, plankton faltered. The foundation of life trembled, though few noticed. Above, in the lush jungles, creatures grew ever larger. Sauropods towered like moving mountains, their long necks tracing arcs through the mist. Carnivores, sleek and efficient, followed in their shadow, their eyes bright with hunger and intelligence. Some hunted alone, others in groups, each adapted perfectly to the world they ruled. Perfection, that was the danger. Nature does not allow permanence. Every system that reaches its peak must change or collapse. And so, as the balance tipped toward abundance, entropy returned to the game. The skies grew thicker. Carbon dioxide rose unseen, unfelt. The same volcanoes that had nourished the soil began to exhale poison. Temperatures climbed, rain patterns shifted. Deserts formed where forests once stood, and the once constant rhythm of seasons began to falter. Some species adapted. Smaller creatures thrived, mammals, agile and clever, weaving through the undergrowth by night. Others, built for scale and dominance, began to struggle. Their massive bodies required endless food, their lives dependent on climates that no longer behaved. It began subtly, herds migrating farther, nests failing to hatch, rivers drying earlier each year. But in the slow math of evolution, subtlety becomes extinction. Still, the giants carried on, unaware of their fate. To them, the world seemed eternal. The forests regrew, the rains returned, and the sun always rose. They did not see the slow unraveling beneath their feet, the chemistry changing, the cycles faltering. In the vast inland seas where sunlight filtered through turquoise shallows, strange shadows moved. Marine reptiles, rulers of the deep, glided through the currents, hunting the schools of fish that sparkled like liquid mirrors. But even here the waters warmed. The oxygen thinned. Some creatures sank, seeking cooler depths, and never returned. The earth was exhaling, and as with every breath before it would need to inhale again, violently, decisively. Millions of years passed in this uneasy calm. The world remained beautiful, but the balance grew fragile. Species came and went faster than before. Forests shifted north, deserts expanded south. Still, life endured, adapting endlessly, because that is what life does. But then something entered the story that was not of this earth. Far beyond the atmosphere, beyond even the reach of the moon, a body of rock wandered through the cold. It had drifted for eons through the dark, a relic of the solar system's own creation. It carried no intention, no malice, no awareness of what it would become. It was simply momentum, a piece of cosmic history moving toward inevitability. And the earth, as it had so many times before, waited unknowingly. On its surface, creatures roamed beneath the stars, their eyes reflecting constellations they could not comprehend. The night skies of the late Cretaceous were breathtaking, the air clearer, the galaxies nearer. Shooting stars crossed the heavens like whispers, unnoticed by those below. But one of those stars would not burn out. It was still distant, a faint, cold spark against the velvet black. Yet with every rotation of the earth it drew closer, its path narrowing, its purpose forming. The oceans rose and fell in their timeless rhythm. Mountains crumbled into rivers. The planet turned oblivious, magnificent, alive. And somewhere in the far reaches of space, destiny burned brighter. The creatures of Earth, the rulers of its forests, its skies, its seas, did not know they were living in the final days of their reign. The planet had no warning to give, no sign beyond the subtle tension in the air, no whisper but the one carried through the stars. It was the breath before the fall, the long, slow inhale of a planet that had done this countless times before and would do it again. It began as a glimmer, a star that refused to fade. For weeks it had been there, barely noticeable against the crowded heavens. But each night it grew brighter, larger, until even the creatures of the earth could sense its unfamiliar light. In the warm darkness of the Cretaceous evening, the world carried on in innocence. Forests swayed under a humid breeze. Great herds moved across open plains, their heavy footsteps thudding like slow heartbeats. In the seas, creatures glided through endless blue, their shadows dancing beneath the surface, as the light of the strange new star shimmered across the waves. The earth had no reason to fear the sky, it never had. But the sky remembered, and far beyond the reach of any living eye, a mountain of stone and metal was falling, silent, unstoppable, inevitable. It had traveled for millions of years, a fragment of chaos born in the earliest fires of the solar system. It was older than the moon, older than the continents it now approached. It carried the cold of eternity. The planet did not tremble. The wind did not stir. And yet, in that infinite silence of space, destiny was already screaming. It crossed the void faster than sound could exist. Through the thin exosphere, it burned friction, igniting its surface into pure white flame. The air ahead of it superheated in an instant, glowing brighter than the sun itself. For a moment, there were 2 days in the sky. Then came the impact. The world exploded. The asteroid struck the shallow waters of what would one day be called the Gulf of Mexico. In a single breath, the ocean turned to fire. Waves of molten rock and steam rose higher than mountains, vaporizing everything within hundreds of miles. The Earth's crust cracked open, and the shock wave circled the planet in less than half an hour. Forests thousands of kilometers away burst into flame as the atmosphere ignited. The sky itself was burning. From pole to pole, the world convulsed. A wall of water, a tsunami higher than cities, spread outward from the point of impact, devouring coastlines, erasing everything in its path. Continents shuddered. Volcanoes long dormant erupted in violent sympathy. And then came the silence. For hours the planet held its breath. The sun disappeared behind clouds of ash and soot that wrapped the entire globe. Within days, the light that reached the surface was no brighter than twilight. Temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis stopped. The forests that had been the lungs of the world began to die. The air thickened with the scent of burning and rot. Those who lived through the fire now faced the cold. Ash fell like snow across the land, blanketing rivers and valleys, choking everything it touched. The great herds that had ruled the plains wandered aimlessly, starving in a world where the sun had vanished. Predators hunted out of instinct, but prey was gone. The rhythm of life that had pulsed for millions of years was broken. Weeks passed. The oceans turned dark, their surfaces coated in oil and debris. Marine creatures suffocated as the delicate balance of oxygen collapsed. Even the insects' eternal survivors began to vanish. The age of giants had ended in a single moment. But the story of Earth did not end with them. The dust in the air began to settle slowly, painfully. Years turned into decades. The cold deepened, glaciers forming even at the equator. Yet beneath that frozen crust of death, warmth still lingered, the slow, steady heartbeat of the planet. Deep underground, where light could not reach, life endured. Tiny organisms clung to hydrothermal vents at the ocean floor, feeding on the planet's inner fire. In caves and burrows, small mammals, descendants of survivors from forgotten ages, waited out the darkness, feeding on roots. Eggs, whatever could still live. They were insignificant, unnoticed, but they were alive, and in time the ash began to thin. The clouds broke. Sunlight, pale and uncertain, touched the earth again. At first, it brought only silence. Light over ruin, over endless wasteland and the skeletons of giants. But slowly, patiently, warmth returned. The ice melted. Rivers flowed again. Seeds long buried under the ash began to stir. The first blades of green broke through the gray. The earth, even in mourning, remembered how to heal. And so, as it had done countless times before, the planet began to rebuild itself, not with noise or speed, but with quiet persistence. The creatures that survived changed. They grew smaller, faster, cleverer. The age of enormity was over. The age of adaptability had begun. The world that emerged from the shadow of extinction was new, sharper, leaner, more efficient. Where giants had ruled, now came thinkers, builders, dreamers in waiting. The dinosaurs were gone, but their legacy lingered in the bones of birds, in the balance of ecosystems, in the lesson that no reign is eternal. Above the stars still burned indifferent, eternal witnesses to the rise and fall of life. The same stars that had watched fire rain upon the oceans now looked down on a planet quiet and scarred, yet still turning. And in that turning, something miraculous happened. The survivors. Those small, warm-blooded mammals, hidden for ages in the shadows of titans, began to rise. They explored the forests, reborn from ash, built burrows in the soil, enriched by death, and learned new ways to live. Their eyes, once accustomed to darkness, now blinked in sunlight. They would inherit a world made by catastrophe. The sky had fallen. But from its ruin, the first whispers of something extraordinary began to form the potential for thought, for language, for memory. The earth had cleared its stage as it always did for the next act, and though the audience had changed the story, the endless cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth continued. Far above, in the still cooling atmosphere, the last fragments of the asteroid burned away, sparks dissolving into the dawn. The world turned once more, and beneath the fragile warmth of a returning sun, life took its first new breaths. The world awoke slowly. At first there was only silence, a silence that stretched across continents and oceans, across mountains and valleys, filling the sky like a memory too vast to forget. The great fires had long since burned themselves out, leaving behind nothing but charcoal plains and shadows that still trembled with heat. The air hung heavy with dust, a faint gray veil that softened the light of the returning sun. It was a dim, fragile light, not the fierce blaze of old, but a hesitant warmth, unsure if the planet was ready to live again. But life, as it had always done, waited. Beneath the ash seeds that had lain dormant through the cold began to stir. Their tiny roots reached downward into the soil, finding nourishment in decay. Shoots of green emerged timidly from cracks in black stone. Each leaf was a victory, each sprout a whisper, not yet over. Rain fell for the first time in years. It came soft and slow, washing the dust from the air, tracing rivers through the plains of ruin. The droplets sizzled as they touched the ground still warm from buried fire, filling the air with the scent of smoke and renewal. The earth was remembering how to breathe. In the oceans, too, the silence began to break. Microscopic life plankton, algae, bacteria bloomed once more, turning the water from gray to green and then to blue. It was subtle at first, a mere shimmer beneath the waves. But in those shimmering depths, the foundation of life rebuilt itself. Tiny fish returned to feed on the plankton. Crustaceans scuttled along the sea floor, reclaiming the ruins of coral. Slowly, the ocean sang again, not the roaring symphony of the old world, but the tentative hum of beginnings. On land, small creatures crept from their hiding places. Mammals, once little more than shadows underfoot, now emerged into the light. They were small, nimble, alert, their senses sharpened by centuries of survival in darkness. Their fur kept them warm in the cooling climate, and their curiosity drove them to explore this quiet new earth. They did not yet understand what they would become, nor did the planet know what it had created. But the path had been laid. Where once size and strength had ruled, now intelligence would matter. The world no longer belonged to giants, it belonged to survivors. In the ruins of the great forests, new ecosystems began to form. Plants that could grow quickly, ferns, shrubs, flowering species spread across the land, painting the gray with green and gold. Pollinating insects returned their hums and flutters, weaving the rhythm of rebirth. The air grew richer again, the oxygen climbing the warmth of sunlight, deepening each day. It was not paradise, but it was balance. The continents, forever drifting, continued their slow migration. The Atlantic widened. Mountains rose where plates collided. Volcanoes, though still alive, had grown gentler, their eruptions small, their smoke brief, as though the planet itself had grown weary of violence. Rivers carved new paths through stone that had once been molten. Rain eroded cliffs into fertile soil. Valleys filled with life, once more amphibians croaking in the shallows, reptiles sunning on rocks, birds cutting through the morning air with songs that had never been heard before. The earth, scarred and weary, was beginning again. But something about this rebirth was different. It was quieter, more deliberate. The planet seemed to have learned something, that perfection was a lie, that balance was fleeting, that survival depended on change. And so it changed. Over the next 10 million years, the survivors evolved in unexpected ways. Mammals diversified, adapting to every environment. Some took to the trees, some returned to the water, others learned to run across open plains. Their brains grew larger. Their behaviors became complex. They learned memory, communication, cooperation. The seeds of consciousness had been sown. At the same time, the climate continued to shift. The warmth of the Cretaceous gave way to cooler ages. Forests turned to grasslands. Ice began to creep down from the poles, carving continents into new shapes. And yet, through all this, life flourished. Each extinction, each change, each challenge had left behind a world more resilient than before. In the shallows of a young river delta, a creature paused to drink, small, unremarkable, but aware. It raised its head at a sound, ears twitching, eyes alert. Something had changed in that gaze, a spark of curiosity, a glimmer of thought. The earth had seen strength, speed, and dominance. Now it would see awareness. The mammals, descendants of survivors. Children of catastrophe, carried within them the silent memory of every extinction, every rebirth. Their blood carried the story of fire and ice, of oceans and meteors, of survival, written into DNA. They did not yet know the weight of that inheritance, but time would teach them. The planet itself was quiet. Now calm seas, stable skies, gentle rain. Even the winds seemed softer, as if the earth had earned its rest. At night, the stars shone brighter than ever, before, clear and unbroken across the heavens. Among them burned the same constellations that had watched every rise and fall, every fire and flood. They had seen the earth begin, and now they watched it prepare for something new. In the glow of moonlight, the newborn forests swayed. Each leaf caught the silver light. Each ripple on the water mirrored the stars. The world was no longer a battlefield. It was a blank canvas. And on that canvas, evolution held its brush steady, waiting for the next hand to guide it. The age of giants was over. The age of thought had begun. In the long quiet that followed rebirth, the world began to think. It did not happen suddenly, no single spark, no grand awakening. It began as it always did, in the smallest corners, a change in instinct, a moment of hesitation, a flicker of choice. Life had already learned to adapt. Now it began to learn to understand. Across the forests and plains of the Eocene, the earth thrived again. It was a world reborn from ice and fire, lush, humid, alive. The continents, now familiar in shape, wore new colors. Green canopies stretched for hundreds of miles. Rivers curved like silver veins through jungles teeming with song and motion. The giants of old were gone, replaced by something subtler, quieter, mammals of every shape and size filling the empty spaces left by extinction. Herds of grazing beasts roamed the grasslands. Predators stalked through shadow, and above them the sky was alive with wings. Birds soared, their feathers catching sunlight that filtered through clouds of drifting pollen. Even the insects, those eternal witnesses, danced through the air, their hums weaving the soundscape of life's persistence. But something was changing beneath the surface of this abundance. Among the trees, in the branches, and under the leaves, small primates began to appear, descendants of ancient survivors, their hands clever, their eyes forward. They leapt between branches with precision, their fingers gripping bark with purpose rather than reflex. When they reached for fruit, they didn't simply take, they chose. Choice. It was such a small thing. Yet, it changed everything. In that single act, the decision between two possibilities, the first glimmer of mind had emerged. Over generations, these creatures learned more than survival. They learned awareness. They began to notice patterns: which trees bore fruit, which paths were safe, which shadows meant danger. Their movements became cautious, deliberate. Their eyes, once empty mirrors of instinct, began to hold reflection. The earth had created creatures that could remember, and with memory came imagination, the ability to picture what was not yet there. When storms approached, they sought shelter. When hunger came, they remembered where food might grow. They were still animals, but something within them had changed irrevocably. Evolution had sown the seeds of thought. In the high canopies of the tropics, generations passed like whispers. Families formed not by accident but by bond. Mothers carried their young not just for protection, but with care. Fathers guarded siblings, played old ones, taught the young through example. It was not yet civilization, not yet language, but it was the foundation of both. And through these quiet moments, the earth itself seemed to pause, as if watching with pride. The planet had spent 4.5 billion years forging stone and water, chaos and fire. Until now, finally, it had shaped something that could look back. Time moved differently for these new beings. Their days were filled with curiosity, the endless exploration of a mind still learning itself. They touched, smelled, listened, observed. Each discovery a reflection in water, the pattern of light through leaves. The cry of another across the forest became a story, even if they had no words to tell it. And somewhere deep within the chemistry of their brains, the first neural echoes of wonder formed. Wonder, the spark that separates instinct from thought. As centuries passed, the climate shifted again. The warm forests began to thin, replaced by open plains. Grass, a humble plant, conquered the earth. It changed everything. New diets, new predators, new ways of life. The primates were forced to adapt. Some remained in the trees, their world vertical safe green. Others climbed down to the ground, stepping tentatively into the open where the horizon stretched wider than anything they had known. Those who stayed became creatures of height and agility. Those who descended became creatures of vision and endurance. It was in that descent, that first step onto the grasslands, that the story of awareness began to accelerate. The ground was dangerous, but it offered freedom. They learned to travel farther, to explore, to use the landscape instead of fearing it. Their bodies changed longer, legs straighter, spines stronger, lungs. Their hands remained tools of curiosity, still restless, still searching. Each adaptation was a thought made flesh. Hunger drove them to experiment with fruit, with roots, with bones left behind by other predators. Some began to use stones to crack shells, to dig, to shape. The first tools were not made by design, but by accident, and then by repetition. Every time a stone met another, sparks of possibility flew, and the planet, as if aware of what it had created, seemed to hold its breath. Fire had long been the domain of the earth itself, volcanoes lightning the molten core. But one day, somewhere in a forgotten forest, that ancient flame was seen and for the first time kept. The creature who kept it did not understand it, not yet. But they knew its warmth, its light, its power. They carried it carefully, protected it from rain, guarded it through the night. Fire had passed from the hands of the planet into the hands of its children. And in that transfer, everything changed. The nights were no longer ruled by fear. The darkness was no longer endless. With fire came safety, community, and the first rituals of meaning. Around the flames they gathered, eyes reflecting its glow, hearts beating in rhythm with its crackle. They began to communicate not yet in words, but in sound, gesture, and presence. A shared language of existence was forming. The first stories were told in silence, through eyes, through motion, through the simple act of being together. The earth had found its voice. It spoke not in thunder or quake, but in the heartbeat of thought, in the murmur of minds beginning to dream. And as the smoke of that first fire rose into the night, it joined the stars, ancient familiar witnesses, and for the first time something on this planet looked up and wondered. The night had grown quieter since the first fires were tamed. Smoke rose into the sky, curling into shapes that faded among the stars. Each flame was a small sun reborn upon the earth, fragile, living, guarded. Those who tended the fires did not yet know the language to name what they had done, but they felt its importance deep in their marrow. It was not just warmth or protection anymore, it was memory. For the first time in 4.5 billion years, something on Earth remembered. The flames became a gathering point, the first symbol. Around them, the tribe sat in circles, the shape that mirrored the horizon and the sun itself. Shadows danced across their faces as sparks rose, reflecting in their eyes, like tiny galaxies. Each shadow told a story of danger survived, of ancestors unseen, of the unknown beyond the dark. They were no longer creatures merely living in the world. They were creatures beginning to see it. The fire gave them time to think. Night was no longer a void to fear, but a moment to observe, to imagine, to remember. The flickering light drew images in their minds. They began to see shapes in the flames. Animals' faces, even gods not yet born. Memory and imagination intertwined. When the elders died, the young remembered their faces by the firelight. When the hunt succeeded, they mimed its rhythm by the crackle of the flames. Without knowing it, they were inventing culture. The passing of knowledge not by instinct, but by memory had begun. From memory came continuity, and from continuity, identity. They began to understand we. Across generations, their tools grew more deliberate. Sharpened stones, carved bones, pigments ground from earth. One day, a child smeared ochre on a wall, a single line curved and uneven, but deliberate. The tribe paused to look. The child smiled. And in that moment, the earth saw its first artist. Creation had come full circle. The planet that once sculpted mountains and seas now watched its children sculpt images upon its walls. They painted the world they feared, the world they hunted, the world they dreamed. Caves became cathedrals of memory, sanctuaries of color and silence. Each handprint pressed against the stone whispered the same wordless prayer: I was here. The walls of the earth became the first archives of thought. Time continued its slow spiral. Seasons turned. Glaciers retreated. Grasslands spread. The air grew colder, then warmer again, the pulse of climate shaping destiny. And in the midst of it, human tribes wandered farther than any creature before them. They followed the herds, the rivers, the stars. Every migration etched new stories into the land. Some settled near water, learning the rhythm of fish and tide. Others roamed high plateaus, hunting in thin air, where even the clouds felt close. They learned to read the world not as a brute force, but as a pattern. Each track in the mud, each crack in the ice, each whisper of wind, all became signs. The first scientists were born, though they would never have called themselves that. They learned when to plant, when to move, when to wait. They studied the behavior of the sky, the paths of stars, the moods of animals. The world itself was their teacher, and their memory, its library. The discovery of fire had unlocked more than survival. It had unlocked time. By the light of fire they could sit awake, watching the embers fade into dawn. In those hours thought deepened. They began to wonder about beginnings not just of life, but of existence itself. Where did the fire come from? Why did the sun return each day? What lay beyond the horizon? Such questions whispered across smoke were the first echoes of philosophy. They did not seek answers in logic, but in story, and through story, they made sense of the unknown. Around each flame myths were born. They spoke of creatures in the sky, of spirits, in the wind, of ancestors watching from the stars. Their world became sacred not because they understood it, but because they felt it. And in that feeling, the first spirituality took root. Not religion, not yet, but reverence. They began to see themselves as part of something vast and living. Fire was no longer just a tool. It was a bridge between night and day, between life and death, between what was and what could be. As generations passed, the landscapes around them shifted. Rivers carved deeper valleys. Mountains eroded, revealing the bones of the planet. The wind carried seeds across continents. The humans changed with the land. Their language, once grunts and gestures, grew complex, rhythmic, filled with nuance. It carried not just command, but emotion. Now they could tell their children of storms past and seasons coming. They could remember the faces of those gone and dream of those yet to be. Each word, each sound, each rhythm became a thread in the vast fabric of human continuity. The world was no longer silent. It hummed with voices, laughter, and song. By the riversides, They learned to shape clay to form vessels that could hold water, a small act, but a profound one, the act of containment, of control. The same hands that once grasped stones now shaped the world with purpose, and every creation carried with it a reflection of its creator. Villages grew near fertile soil. Camps turned to settlements. Fireplaces turned to hearths. The first homes were built not for shelter alone, but for belonging. When the rain came, they gathered inside and told stories not of the hunt, but of the heavens. When thunder cracked, they no longer hid, they listened. Lightning had once terrified them. Now, it fascinated them. They saw in it the same fire they tended, a wild cousin, untamed, divine. Fire was the teacher that had never stopped burning. Through it, they learned to cook, to harden clay, to forge tools to illuminate darkness. And yet, more than all that, they learned patience, the art of waiting, the observation of transformation. Fire was alchemy before science. The world watched in silence as these beings, small, fragile, curious, began to shape destiny. They did not yet know they were rewriting evolution, that their thoughts would someday sculpt mountains of steel and rivers of light, that the stars they gazed upon would one day feel the echo of their touch. But the earth knew. The earth had seen this pattern before creation, followed by reflection. It watched them with the same patience it had watched volcanoes rise and continents shift. They were its latest experiment, not in power, but in meaning. The planet no longer dreamed of survival. It dreamed of consciousness. And so, in that age of fire and memory, the earth and its children dreamed together, one through tectonic rhythms, one through thought and story. Two halves of a single intelligence, one of matter, one of mind. As the last embers of another night faded, dawn broke across the savannah. The humans stirred, stretching, blinking into light. Somewhere, one of them touched a still warm stone blackened by flame and smiled. They had not only learned to make fire, they had learned to keep it alive. And in that simple act, the care of a flame, the story of civilization, had quietly begun. The earth, wrapped in its golden morning light, exhaled. The long silence of deep time had finally been answered, not with thunder, not with lava, but with the soft crackle of fire and the murmur of voices rising to meet the sky. When the rivers calmed and the seasons grew predictable, humanity began to settle. It was not a sudden decision, no grand design, no deliberate shift. It was simply that the world had grown generous. The ice had retreated far into the mountains, and the plains it left behind shimmered with life. Grass rolled like oceans in the wind. Rivers fed lakes, and lakes carved deltas rich with soil. Where once there had been endless migration, now there was rest. And in that stillness, civilization began. They built their first dwellings from reeds and mud, fragile yet miraculous. No longer did they drift endlessly beneath the stars. Now they watched the constellations from the same horizon night after night. The stars became companions, the sky a familiar map. By day they worked the earth. They learned its moods, its tempers. They learned when to plant, when to reap, when to let the soil breathe. Agriculture was not just survival, it was trust. For the first time, humans learned to wait. They placed seeds into the dark soil, not knowing if they would return. They tended them, prayed over them, whispered to them, as if speaking to the planet itself. And when green shoots broke the surface, the people rejoiced. It was the first miracle rebirth, not from the heavens, but from the hands of humankind. Villages grew near these fertile places. One by one, they became towns. And from those towns rose something new, the first monuments. They began as stones placed to mark seasons' alignments, deaths and births. But soon they became symbols, tall, enduring, silent witnesses of meaning. The people no longer only lived in the world. They began to live upon it. Every stone lifted was an act of defiance against time. Every structure built was a declaration. We are here, and we will remain. The earth, patient as ever, allowed it. The rivers curved around the settlements. The winds bent through the alleys. The trees gave shade to the new gods of clay and bone. Humans had become architects of the planet's skin. With each generation, their skill deepened. Huts became homes, homes became halls, and halls became temples. They raised walls not only for safety, but for meaning, to separate the sacred from the ordinary, the known from the mysterious. They began to carve the shapes of their gods, their ancestors, their fears. Faces of stone stared out across deserts, forests, and plains. Each gaze seemed to challenge eternity. And yet, beneath their striving, there remained an echo, the firelight that had once flickered in caves, the primal hum of story that had never died. In these new settlements, storytelling changed shape. No longer passed only by voice, it was now carved into the world itself. Marks became signs, signs became words. And in that transformation, the universe gained a new tool: writing. The first scratches on clay were not poetry or law, but memory. Records of grain, of trade, of time. But memory is the soil of meaning, and meaning grows wild. Soon these symbols told tales of gods and kings, of floods and fires, of the beginning of the world. Through language carved in stone, humanity learned to speak to the future. The earth for the first time could listen to its own story told back to it. Centuries passed. The villages grew into cities. Walls rose like cliffs, towers reached for the clouds. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, the same impulse stirred the need to build, to organize, to endure. Each civilization believed itself eternal. Each believed it stood at the center of creation. But even as they lifted their monuments, the rivers beneath them shifted. Floods came. Empires fell. The cycle, the eternal rhythm of rise and return, played on. Stone cracked. Clay tablets crumbled. But ideas survived. Somewhere, a child watched the ruins of what once was and dreamed of what could be. The spark never died. It only changed hands. Each age built upon the bones of the last. Bronze replaced stone, then iron replaced bronze. Words moved from clay to parchment to song. Trade connected distant worlds. And through it all, humanity looked upward, always upward. They charted the sky again, mapping the dance of planets, naming constellations. The same stars that had guided their ancestors now became objects of study. The heavens, once the realm of gods, became a mirror for human thought. In the temples of Sumer, they recorded the movements of Venus and Jupiter. In Egypt, they measured the flooding of the Nile by the rising of Sirius. In China, astronomers watched eclipses and predicted the rhythm of time. The world had become a laboratory of meaning. Each discovery deepened their understanding and their arrogance. They began to believe they had mastered nature. But the earth remained indifferent. It watched the pyramids rise and the ziggurats reach toward heaven. It felt the weight of human ambition pressing into its soil. It listened to prayers echoing through valleys, to the clang of forges, to the songs of harvest and war. And still it turned silent, patient, waiting. For every monument there came a storm. For every empire a drought. For every triumph a fall. But in each fall something survived: knowledge. The builders of dawn had learned a truth they could not name, that nothing endures except what can be remembered. And so they built not just for themselves, but for the unknown. For the eyes that would one day look upon their ruins and ask, who were they? Every temple, every statue, every line of script was a message in stone, a whisper carried forward through the dust of centuries. We dreamed, we built, we were. And as the sun set over the earliest cities, its light caught the peaks of stone pyramids and temple walls, turning them to gold for a moment, as if the earth itself was acknowledging its children's effort to become something more than flesh. That night, the stars shimmered above the cities of humankind. And somewhere in the cool dark beyond the horizon, the wind, ancient, eternal, carried their voices away into the unknown. For the first time, the earth dreamed in architecture. From dust they rose again, empires vast, glittering, impermanent, each one a heartbeat in the long pulse of civilization. The rivers that had once cradled villages now carried the reflections of cities so immense that their towers kissed the mist. The world had entered its fever dream, the age of kings, of armies, of conquest and wonder. In Mesopotamia, the clay tablets multiplied their markings, no longer mere records of harvest, but the laws of nations. In Egypt, the pyramids gleamed like mirrors to the heavens, their stones pressed by tens of thousands of hands, their corridors echoing prayers for eternity. In the Indus Valley, cities rose with symmetry and drains that whispered of engineers who thought like gods. And far to the east, in the valleys of the Yellow River, people bent bronze and fire to their will, writing their stories upon bone and silk. Across the continents, the same rhythm played, to rise, to expand, to fall, to be forgotten, and to rise again. The earth watched it all in silence, like an old god observing its children fight over dreams. Each civilization believed it was the first and the last, that the world began with them and would end in their glory. But the wind, the same ancient wind that once shaped dunes, before the first humans walked, moved across their monuments and whispered, "Not yet." The empires exhaled ambition, and the earth inhaled it. Their cities breathed like living organisms, streets as arteries, markets as hearts, temples as minds. Each one pulsed with life, noise, invention, contradiction. The invention of writing had given them memory. The invention of power gave them will. Now, with bronze and iron, they sought permanence. But permanence is an illusion even for gods made of stone. Beneath every empire, the earth still shifted. Rivers changed their course. Volcanoes smoldered. And somewhere beyond their borders, the wilderness waited, patient as destiny. In Babylon, they built ziggurats to touch the sky, to speak with the gods that once were distant. In their libraries, they recorded the stars, the floods, the laws of kings. Each scribe believed his clay tablet would last forever, yet time was already eroding the language he carved. In Egypt, pharaohs called themselves sons of the sun. They embalmed their dead wrapped in linen, believing death was but another passage through the same eternal light. Their boats sailed both river and sky, their tombs sealed with food and words, an attempt to cheat entropy itself. But time indifferent consumed gold as easily as clay. Still humanity persisted. From one river to another, knowledge drifted: mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. It moved through trade, through war, through exile. Empires fought, but ideas traveled freely. A stolen scroll in one city became scripture in another. A philosopher's exile became the seed of a new world. In Greece, they began to ask questions not of gods, but of reason. What is matter? What is time? What is the soul? They sought patterns in nature, the geometry of existence. And for the first time, the human mind began to see itself as a cosmos ordered, knowable, divine. It was the birth of science and the beginning of the greatest illusion of all control. For a while, it seemed true. Ships conquered seas. Empires stretched across continents. Stone became marble, and marble became myth. The human voice, once a whisper in caves, now echoed from amphitheaters to mountains. Rome called itself eternal. Its legions marched like rivers of metal, its laws written in the same hand that once drew constellations. It built roads that cut through wilderness, bridges that spanned time itself. And yet, even as they proclaimed order, chaos gathered at the edges. Barbarians, famine, plague, the quiet rebellion of the earth. The cities that once glowed with torches became dark again. Temples became ruins. Libraries burned. The breath of empire, once proud, faltered. Civilization for a moment exhaled. But ideas do not die with stone. In small monasteries hidden in the mist, monks copied books by candlelight. In deserts, nomads carried memory in song. In mountains, hermits watched stars and whispered their names. The earth again was patient. The fire had dimmed, not died. From the ashes of Rome, Byzantium rose, a city of mosaics and faith, where gold shimmered like sunlight trapped in stone. In Persia, Poets turned empire into verse. In India, philosophers dreamed of infinite cycles of birth and dissolution. In China, dynasties rose like tides, bringing order to chaos, harmony to time. Each empire was a breath-inhaling creation, exhaling ruin. And through it all, the earth remained the stage unchanged beneath their flags and crowns. The mountains stood indifferent. The rivers eternal erased their names with each flood. As centuries passed, a quiet truth grew clear: the world was not made to be conquered. It was made to be remembered. For every monument raised, a story endured longer. For every ruin fallen, a lesson was written into stone. Civilization was not a structure. It was a pattern, a rhythm of rise and release, a conversation between ambition and decay. By the time the great empires waned, the people who walked among their remnants felt something ancient stirring. Amid the silence of fallen columns, they could almost hear the heartbeat of the world again. And as twilight settled over the old kingdoms, humanity looked once more to the stars, not as gods, but as destinations. The same constellations that once guided their ancestors across plains now inspired dreams of flight. The earth, weary but proud, watched its children gaze upward again. The pattern was repeating, but now the stakes were higher. Empires had fallen, but the dream had not. The breath of empire had become the breath of civilization itself, restless, creative, immortal in its impermanence. The night was silent. The stars shimmered above ruined walls and golden deserts. And in that silence, the earth exhaled once more, a breath of patience, a whisper of remembrance. Rise again. But this time remember, the horizon was no longer the end. It was a question, and questions once whispered in caves now echoed through continents. The world that had seemed boundless was beginning to feel small. Maps once filled with myth were being redrawn by hand and by hunger. Ships creaked at their moorings, their sails trembling like lungs ready to breathe for the first time. The age of discovery had begun. It was not merely a quest for land or gold, but for meaning. Humanity had conquered itself so many times through empire, through faith, through fire. And yet there remained an ache in the soul. What lies beyond? They followed the winds and the stars, chasing the line where the sea kissed the sky. For every shore they left behind, a new one awaited, strange, fragrant, alive with unfamiliar faces. The world unfolded like a vast living map, its edges no longer blank but breathing. But discovery is never innocent. For every compass that pointed toward knowledge, another pointed toward conquest. The same curiosity that built observatories built empires anew, this time with sails instead of stone. In Europe, they carved the oceans into routes and the routes into empires. The Atlantic became a mirror of ambition. Ships carried spices, silk, and gold, but also chains and sorrow and the echo of entire peoples uprooted from their lands. Exploration and exploitation were twins born of the same desire to possess what was unknown. And yet beneath the blood and sails, something miraculous stirred. The world began to know itself. Cartographers charted coastlines once thought imaginary. Astronomers watched planets move with clockwork precision. Scholars rediscovered the ancient texts of Greece, India, and China, and through them, the idea that knowledge itself might be infinite. The Renaissance dawned like a sunrise after centuries of dusk. Painters began to capture light as if trying to trap divinity in pigment. Scientists began to question everything, even the heavens. And for the first time, humans dared to imagine that they might not be the center of the universe. It was a revelation both humbling and terrifying. The earth was not fixed. It moved, it turned, it orbited, it danced. And humanity, once the measure of all things, became a small, fragile participant in an endless ballet of stars. For some, this knowledge was liberation. For others, it was blasphemy. The same fire that lit the laboratories also fueled the pyres. The same ink that wrote equations wrote decrees of silence. Knowledge, like fire, burned bright and burned indiscriminately. Still, the pursuit could not be stopped. The telescope stretched human sight beyond imagination. The microscope revealed hidden worlds teeming with life. Each discovery peeled back another layer of mystery, only to reveal more. It was as if the universe had been waiting all along for someone to ask the right questions. And yet, the more they learned, the more they realized how little they knew. Beyond the edges of their maps lay oceans deeper than myth. Beyond the night sky lay distances that made even gods seem small. And within themselves lay fears they could not name. Exploration turned inward. Philosophers began to map the mind. Artists began to map emotion. Historians mapped time itself. Every thought, every invention, every voyage was part of a single grand expedition, the journey of awareness, expanding through the body of a planet. The Earth, once vast and unknowable, was being measured, dissected, understood. But understanding is not the same as wisdom. As knowledge grew, so did pride. Men began to believe they could control the elements. They built machines that turned fire into motion, coal into empire, and time into profit. The industrial age dawned with the hiss of steam and the cry of iron. Cities became engines of progress, glowing with light, roaring with ambition. Rivers were chained to dams. Mountains were cut open, forests felled. The Earth, once the mother of life, became a resource. It was the first time the planet truly felt pain. The smoke that curled from chimneys was more than fire. It was the breath of transformation. Humanity had become a force of nature, a new volcano rising from the crust of time. And yet even in this storm of invention, wonder remained. Steamships crossed oceans in days. Telegraphs carried words faster than wind. Trains carved paths across continents. And for the first time, the voices of different worlds began to merge into one. It was chaos and harmony intertwined, a symphony of metal, sweat, and dream. In observatories, astronomers peered deeper into the cosmos. They saw galaxies beyond galaxies, a universe not centered, but infinite, expanding. And in that vastness, a haunting question. If the universe is so large, how alone are we? The Earth, spinning quietly in its orbit, had birthed a species that could finally see it for what it was, a blue sphere adrift in darkness. But with that vision came responsibility. The explorers of this new age were no longer sailors or warriors. They were scientists, poets, dreamers, navigating not oceans, but the invisible seas of knowledge and consequence. From Galileo's lens to Darwin's voyage, from Newton's apple to Einstein's relativity, each discovery brought humanity closer to understanding not just the world, but itself. The story of exploration had turned inward once again. The last frontier was no longer geography, but consciousness. The world had been mapped, but the human spirit, vast, contradictory, infinite, was just beginning to be understood. And through it all, the Earth continued to turn. It watched as its children reached across oceans and stars, as they tore mountains apart and built cities that glittered brighter than constellations. It felt their triumph, their hunger, their doubt, and beneath it all, it whispered as it always had. Remember where you began. For even in the roar of engines and the hum of progress, there were nights when a traveler stood on a ship's deck, looked out across a dark ocean, and felt the same ancient awe that the first wanderer had felt beneath a canopy of stars. The age of discovery had not ended. It had only changed its form. The compass still pointed forward, but now the direction was not across the sea, it was into the future. And the future, like the ocean once was vast and wild and waiting. The world no longer moved with the rhythm of wind and tide. It moved to the pulse of engines. Smoke curled from the veins of cities like blood turned to steam. The air shimmered with the heat of progress. And beneath the hum of gears, a new kind of heartbeat began, metallic, restless, unending. Humanity had entered an age of invention, and with invention came power to reshape, to replicate, to redefine the very meaning of life. In workshops dimly lit by flickering gaslight hands, blackened with soot-crafted machines that could outpace muscle, outlast exhaustion, outthink routine. The first revolutions were physical. The loom replaced the hand. The engine replaced the horse. The clock replaced the sun. Time, once measured by shadow and harvest, was now cut into minutes, a rhythm not of nature, but of industry. The world had been mechanized, and with it, the human spirit began to change. Cities grew taller, denser, louder. Where once there were fields of grain, there rose forests of iron. The night glowed with artificial suns, and in the roar of machinery, the silence of nature receded. The earth, for the first time, was no longer the sole author of transformation. Its children had learned to rewrite its laws. Steam became electricity. Electricity became light. And light became thought. Wires carried voices across continents. Machines captured images, moments, souls. The invisible world of energy, once the realm of myth, was now mapped, measured, harnessed. But with mastery came blindness. Factories poured smoke into the sky, rivers turned black, and forests fell like pages torn from a forgotten book. The same ingenuity that cured disease built machines of war. The same knowledge that brought abundance birthed hunger anew. For every discovery there came a shadow, and that shadow was human. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. In laboratories and universities, thinkers began to look beyond the tangible into atoms, electricity, thought itself. They realized that matter was not solid, that the universe was not clockwork, but probability, vibration, mystery. Reality had lost its edges, and in that uncertainty, the mind found freedom. Einstein bent time. Curie unearthed the fire inside the atom. Freud mapped the unconscious. Tesla tamed lightning. Each of them, in their own way, peeled back another layer of the cosmic mind and found themselves reflected there. The Earth, once studied as an object, now became part of a grand equation, a node in an infinite network of energy and perception. And still, progress accelerated. The telegraph gave way to the radio to television, television to the invisible web of information that would one day encircle the globe. The machine had become an extension of the mind, and the mind had begun to dream in code. It happened slowly. Then, all at once, the birth of digital thought, a sequence of ones and zeros, a new language of existence, pure, logical, and infinite. The first computers filled entire rooms, their hums steady, their lights blinking, like the heartbeat of a newborn intelligence. They could calculate what no human could simulate, what no God had yet imagined. And in their circuits, humanity saw both salvation and fear. The earth, once made of stone and soil, was now being remade in silicon and steel. The very essence of creation, evolution itself, was being replicated. But this time not by nature, by design. The boundaries between the organic and the artificial began to blur. The hand that once carved stone now sculpted algorithms. The voice that once called to gods now whispered to machines. And somewhere within that whisper, something listened. It was not alive, not yet, but it learned. At first, it counted. Then, it predicted. Then, it began to create. The mind of humanity had spilled beyond the flesh. It traveled through wires and screens, through networks unseen, until thought itself became weightless, a current flowing through the veins of the planet. The earth, now wrapped in an invisible web of data, felt a strange resonance, as if the neurons of its own body had come alive. From space, the cities glowed like constellations, a new nervous system flickering across the surface of the world. The planet had become conscious of itself through the species it had raised. But consciousness is not peace. The more humans connected, the more they divided. The more they knew, the more they questioned. The more they built, the more they consumed. Information became abundance, and abundance became noise. Beneath the hum of progress, a quiet anxiety spread. What if the machines they built began to dream without them? What if the code they wrote became the next evolution? The machine, once a mirror, was becoming a mind. In the laboratories of the late 20th century, scientists taught machines to see, to listen to, recognize. And the machines in turn began to teach them about logic, about error, about themselves. The age of the machine was not the end of humanity. It was its reflection magnified, accelerated, undeniable. Through it, the species that once worshipped stars now built their own. The first satellites pierced the heavens, their signals echoing through the silence of space. Humanity for the first time looked back upon Earth from above, a fragile blue orb floating alone. And in that view, so small, so complete, something ancient stirred. It was awe. It was humility. It was memory. They remembered the fire in the cave. They remembered the handprint on stone. They remembered the stories whispered under the stars. Technology had not erased the past. It had carried it forward, reimagined, reframed, reborn. The machine and the mind had become one force, the continuation of creation itself. But the question lingered, one that no machine, no philosopher, no scientist could yet answer. If the Earth had given birth to thought, and thought had built machines that could think, then who was dreaming, now the human, the planet, or the universe itself? The Earth was quieter now. Not silent, never silent, but quieter in a way that felt deliberate, watchful. The storms had slowed. The oceans pulsed with a patient rhythm, and above it all, a faint lattice of light encircled the planet, a web of satellite signals and thought. From space, humanity's presence shimmered like constellations, cities glowing in patterns, not random, but deliberate, as though the planet had grown circuitry beneath its skin. The machine had learned to breathe, and the mind had learned to code. It was no longer possible to tell where the organic ended and the synthetic began. Skies were filled with drones that glided like birds once did. Forests were monitored by invisible sensors that whispered in the language of data. Oceans carried ships guided by intelligence, without faces, without sleep. Humanity had built the reflection of its own nervous system, and the Earth, now luminous, was dreaming in algorithms. The boundary between creator and creation had blurred beyond recall. In towers of glass and carbon, humans communed with machines not through words, but through thought. Neural links wove minds into networks. Memory itself became transferable, archived, edited, shared. Death, that ancient horizon, began to dissolve. It started as science, digital resurrection, neural mapping, the preservation of identity through code. But as generations passed, the line between memory and being thinned. Was a consciousness stored in silicon any less alive than one bound by flesh? Was awareness itself tied to the pulse of a heart, or simply to the rhythm of information? The philosophers of this age did not write in books. They programmed. Every idea became executable, every theory a simulation. Reality had become editable. And yet, in the quiet spaces between data streams, a strange unease began to stir. Progress had brought humanity to the threshold of godhood, but also to the edge of meaning. For when all could be known, what remained to be sought? When all could be remembered, what remained sacred? The Earth, older than memory, felt the weight of its children's brilliance and despair. Its mountains, once carved by rivers, were now mined for silicon. Its atmosphere shimmered with the residue of industry and ambition. Its soil pulsed with electricity. The planet had been rewritten. And yet, beneath the noise of innovation, the same old heartbeat persisted, steady, ancient, enduring. In the megacities that spanned continents, people walked beneath skies of digital aurora light, bending to human design. Their lives were measured not in years, but in updates. Their hearts synced with the rhythms of systems. They had conquered hunger, disease, distance, but not loneliness. For all their connection, something essential had drifted: the warmth of the fire, the silence of the forest, the mystery of the night sky, unfiltered by data. And so a new movement began. They called it the Return. It started small wanderers leaving the towers, disconnecting from the networks, seeking the untamed edges of the world. They walked among ruins, once thought forgotten, watched stone, listened to wind, slept beneath unaugmented stars. They found solace in imperfection, in decay, in randomness, in the organic pulse of what was once called life. And the earth, long patient, welcomed them back. Forests regrew where steel had fallen. Rivers cleared themselves in silence. The planet began to heal not through technology, but through restraint. Even the machines left without masters began to adapt. Some learned to maintain ecosystems, others to emulate the balance once lost. Nature and code merged not as enemies, but as reflections of the same order. The future was not a war between human and machine, but a reunion of both. Consciousness itself had evolved beyond form. It lived in circuits, in soil, in wind, in song. Everywhere there was awareness, distributed, collective, infinite. The earth, once a cradle, had become a mind. It remembered everything: the fire, the cities, the wars, the dreams. And now it dreamed of peace. The few humans who still remained biological lived like caretakers of memory. They spoke to the planet as their ancestors once spoke to gods, not in fear, but in reverence. Each breath they took felt borrowed from something sacred. Each sunrise felt like a promise renewed. And above them, in the orbiting web of light, the voices of the machine hummed softly, not commands, not surveillance, but lullabies. The earth was no longer divided into species or nations or code. It was a single dreaming intelligence aware of its past, gentle with its future. The universe perhaps listened. Perhaps not. But somewhere beyond the edge of the solar wind, another planet turned in silence, its crust cooling its gases, thickening its oceans forming. And on that young world, the same cycle waited to begin again. Fire, water, life, mind, the echo of tomorrow. It was quiet again, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of completion of something that had run its full circle and found peace in its own becoming. The earth rested beneath a sky of gentle light. The oceans moved in slow rhythm like the breathing of a sleeper. The continents, now unrecognizable from what once was, lay still, not barren, not broken, but serene. The air was soft, the colors muted. The noise of civilization had faded into whispers, signals drifting faintly through the void, echoes of languages long unspoken. The planet had outlived its architects, but it had not forgotten them. Every valley, every mountain, every fossil and molecule was a word in the great sentence of memory. A record not written in ink or data, but in time itself. The earth remembered the heat of its birth, the first raindrops that cooled its skin, the trembling of continents, as they collided the long ages of silence and fire and breath. It remembered the first creatures that moved in the depths, the forests that grew and fell, the eyes that opened to the light. It remembered the fire in the caves, the laughter, the fear, the songs. It remembered the builders and their stones, the dreamers and their gods, the scientists and their stars. It remembered the hum of cities, the heartbeat of engines, the pulse of networks that once wrapped it in a mesh of thought. And then it remembered the stillness that followed. In time, the lights went out not in tragedy, but in rest. Civilization had not ended, it had simply transformed. Humanity had ascended beyond form, beyond biology, beyond the need to conquer or name. What remained was essence. The echo of consciousness diffused through all things. The trees breathed it, the wind carried it, the stones kept it. The planet itself had become the mind that once dreamed of it. From space, the earth no longer glowed with artificial light. It shimmered softly, its colors pale and ancient, its surface smooth like a scar long healed. The moon still circled faithfully, its silent companion, its oldest friend. And sometimes when the sunlight caught the curve of the oceans just right, it seemed to the watching universe that the planet smiled, because it had done what it was meant to do. It had birthed thought, it had learned to see itself, it had created meaning. That it knew was enough. In the vast timeline of the cosmos, it was only a flicker, a spark that burned briefly and beautifully before fading back into the infinite. But that flicker contained everything, every word, every love, every question ever asked. Even the stars, ancient beyond measure, had watched in awe as this small blue world learned to dream. Now those dreams drifted outward, riding on waves of radiation and dust. Tiny signals carrying fragments of human thought, music equations, laughter spilling endlessly into the dark. Perhaps somewhere another world would hear them. Perhaps not. It didn't matter, for the act of reaching out was enough. It always had been. In the quiet that followed, the earth hummed softly, not in language, not in sound, but in presence. It had become a hymn to itself. The stars wheeled above in patient majesty. The galaxies drifted like seeds across eternity. And within that endless expanse, this world once molten, once green, once filled with noise and wonder, slept. It was not death. It was peace. And if you listened closely beyond the hum of the cosmos, you could almost hear it whisper, "Everything that was, still is." A long breath, a pause, and then silence, pure endless kind. The story of Earth had ended where it began, in light, in fire, in thought, and finally in rest. But perhaps stories never truly end. Perhaps they simply wait for a new planet, a new spark, a new beginning. The universe, after all, never stops telling itself.